Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, and this is the Autoimmune Protocol Lecture Series, Week 1, Lecture 2, The History of Dietary Recommendations and the Rise in Chronic Illness. Before we get into the Autoimmune Protocol as a dietary template, let's talk a little bit about how we got here, how we got to this place where autoimmune disease is epidemic in our society and government dietary guidelines are so far off the mark. Our understanding of nutritional sciences really is fairly recent when you consider other branches of science. So it really started in the late 1700s when a scientist noticed that nitrogen was a dominant constituent of plants like grass, and that nitrogen was part of decomposing meat. So nitrogen is a important molecule, important atom in the protein molecules. And this scientist was able to see that nitrogen was a common constituent, and he was the first person to think, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe the nitrogen from the plants got into the cow's muscle meat, and that food might provide something, beyond basic sustenance, right? This idea that we need food to live, but maybe there's things in food that make up our bodies. And that was a revolutionary idea. And it spurred basically the entire field of nutritional sciences. Now, initially, from the 1700s to the early 1900s, nutritional sciences was basically focused on identifying macronutrients, as well as understanding digestion and how we break down food in our digestive tracts, how muscles use energy in order to contract. So that was the initial foray into nutritional sciences. So what came out of that was understanding protein, sugar, starch, and fat. Starting in the mid-1800s, studies began to look at identifying nutritional links to illnesses. And so there was this huge class of illnesses at the time that didn't appear to be infectious. So for example, scurvy, which was rampant on ships, for example. And there was some folk cures, so they knew that eating fresh fruits and vegetables could cure scurvy in a fairly short period of time. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of ships would carry certain types of fruit and vegetables on the ship to prevent scurvy. But there was not an idea of what was in those fruits and vegetables. It was vitamin C that was actually the important and therapeutic nutrient for scurvy. So beginning to look at these diseases that were all diseases of nutrient deficiencies. They knew they weren't infectious, but they didn't really understand the cause. And so the mid-18th century started to identify, right? Vitamin C deficiency was behind scurvy. Vitamin D deficiency was behind rickets. Vitamin A deficiency was behind night blindness. Vitamin B1 deficiency was behind beriberi. Vitamin B3 deficiency was behind pellagra. Iron deficiency behind anemia, and iodine deficiency was causing goiters. And being able to understand that these were the nutrients that were in the therapeutic foods that people sort of already figured out, right? There was already all of this folk medicine around, giving people with rickets cod liver oil. Well, cod liver oil is very, very high in vitamin D. Animal liver was given to people with night blindness. Liver is the best food source of retinoic acid, or the active form of vitamin A. Rice bran was actually a therapeutic for beriberi. So we saw beriberi in populations that were eating a lot of polished rice instead of brown rice, in these populations where rice was almost their only food source. And if they switched from polished rice to whole bran rice, the brown rice would prevent beriberi. Pellagra with vitamin B3 deficiency, they're using yeast supplements to be able to treat that. For anemia, the earliest treatments were iron salts or iron filings steeped in wine. So they already had these amazing ways of curing these nutrient deficiency diseases without actually, at that point, understanding what it was in these cures that was actually providing some valuable nutrient that the body was missing. So the first essential minerals that were identified as being important for health were iodine, which was discovered in 1820 as a health-promoting mineral and a treatment for goiter. iron, which was discovered in 1872 as a treatment for anemia, and zinc, discovered in 1873 as a treatment for childhood diarrhea caused by zinc deficiency. By the late 1800s, the prevailing dogma held that there were 4 essential elements of nutrition: protein, carbohydrates, fats, and minerals. Well, that was completely blown out of the water in 1912 when the first vitamin was discovered. Vitamin A was discovered in 1912, 1913, and from there, an explosion in nutritional sciences took place. So many, many vitamins and many more essential minerals were identified and their roles in human health identified between 1912 and 1985. And as each one of these nutrients was identified, it expanded our understanding of how food can impact human health, beyond just understanding that if you're deficient in one or more nutrients, that can cause some types of deficiency diseases. We started to understand that these vitamins and minerals were supporting normal functions in our body all the time. And it's at this time when our understanding of vital nutrients is really just starting to come together that the USDA published their first dietary recommendations. Now, from the 1910s to the 1970s, when these recommendations were put together, the dominant focus was preventing malnutrition. So, for example, a lot of the recommendations were also combined with food fortification. So, for example, in the 1920s, we started iodizing salt to prevent goiters. In the 1930s, we started fortifying milk with vitamin D to prevent rickets. In the 1940s, we started enrichment of bread and cereal with B vitamins and iron, again, to prevent nutritional deficiencies. And in the 1980s, it was adding calcium to everything. I mean, that was what the 1980s, it wasn't just about, hair and lacy gloves. It was also about adding calcium to foods, everything that you could possibly imagine. So in addition to food fortification, the communication to the public in terms of what to eat was really focused on avoiding starvation and avoiding malnutrition. So the initial recommendations were simply eat a lot of food, right? And eat high-calorie foods. And that's because starvation and malnutrition was really rampant in America at that time. In 1944, the Basic 7 was introduced as a USDA dietary guideline. And this was really a very good attempt at dividing foods into groups based on the micronutrients that we knew. So based on understanding that vitamin C was very important and vitamin A was really important. So the division of these groups might seem a bit strange to us now because we know so much more about nutrition, but it was really looking at dividing foods into groups based on the nutrients that we knew at the time. So there were 7 food groups: green and yellow vegetables, oranges, tomatoes, grapefruit, cabbage, and salad greens. Those were all foods known to be very, very high in vitamin C. Potatoes and other vegetables and fruit kind of got lumped into another category. Milk and milk products were one category, but butter got its own food group purely because of its vitamin A content. Meat, poultry, fish, or eggs, protein, and bread, flour, and cereals was a separate group. And there was recommended servings from each group, but really get some from each food group and then eat other foods as you like to round out your meals. The problem with the Basic 7 might have been the fact that it was still based on rudimentary information in terms of nutrients. But the other problem was the communication aspect. It confused people. The public didn't like it. They just found it overwhelming. And so what the government dietary guidelines then decided to do with that, basically rejection by the public of the Basic 7 was simplify the guidelines. So instead of looking at a micronutrient focus, which, as you'll see later, that's what the autoimmune protocol is, instead of going for let's incorporate now the new information that we have in terms of micronutrients and divide these into food groups in a smarter way. Instead, it was, let's just look at how food is grown. We'll divide it into 4 groups. So this was the Basic 4. It was introduced in 1956. The 4 food groups were vegetables and fruits with a recommendation to eat at least 4 servings a day. Milk, dairy products with a recommendation to consume 4 servings a day for teens and 2 servings a day for adults. Meat was 2 servings a day, and cereal and breads was 4 servings a day, with And this is the quote, "Other foods is needed to round out meals and satisfy appetites." So remember that in this day and time, starvation was a much bigger problem than overnutrition, which of course is more the issue now. During this time is also when cardiovascular disease started to increase. So during the 1950s, the 1960s, we had the advent of the grocery store, TV dinners, microwavable foods. The food supply was starting to change. We were getting more refined and manufactured foods. We were changing from buying your meat from the butcher and your vegetables from the farm stand to a very, very different food system. And so in the 60s and 70s, as government officials and scientists were trying to understand the link between food and these diseases that were starting to increase, the focus was very macronutrient focused. But of course, the basic four was more macronutrient focused than micronutrient focused, because it was more about basically how food is grown rather than the constituent nutrients that might benefit our bodies. So heart disease was one of the major drivers of the change in nutritional guidelines. And that was looking at research by Pritikin and Keyes and Yudkin, and looking at sugar versus fat as the problem behind cardiovascular disease. And as you know, this became the new dietary recommendations, very macronutrient focused, that led to the food pyramid. In the 1970s, it was very much reduce fat, reduce salt, don't worry about sugar, and eventually that led to probably the worst dietary recommendations in the history of humanity, the food guide pyramid, that had from 4 servings of grains in the basic 4 to 5 to 11 servings of grains in the food pyramid, 2 to 4 servings of fruit, and 3 to 5 servings of vegetables, 2 to 3 servings of dairy, 2 to 3 servings of meat, and then fats, oils, and sugars as the junk food. This, of course, completely focused dietary choices on the least nutritious foods available to us, and we're going to get into that in more detail. But these grain-based foods really have very few by way of micronutrients to offer us, especially compared to vegetables and fruit and meat and seafood. This was refined to add an activity and hydration component with the My Pyramid in 2005. And then eventually My Plate in 2011, which started to focus a little bit on portion control, because it turns out that 5 to 11 servings of grains is a lot of calories. Now, you already know the answer to this question. How have dietary guidelines worked? You know it because you're here and you're watching this lecture series. They haven't worked well at all. So cardiovascular disease, which was already on the rise in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, increased dramatically with this focus on grain-based low-fat diets. And in fact, when you look at how the incidence in cardiovascular disease, this is incidence of cardiovascular disease procedures, you see that it's leveled off. That has a lot more to do with advances in medical technology than it has to do with actual people getting cardiovascular disease because of poor diet and lifestyle choices. If you look at the number of people who are dying, again, that's actually started to come down from cardiovascular disease, but it really is related to our ability to intervene and save your life rather than how dietary recommendations have maybe decreased incidence. And this is probably my favorite graph to show that, because this looks at hospital discharges due to cardiovascular disease over the last 30, 40 years. And you can see that it's increasing. Now, it's important to say, okay, well, you say, well, discharges are great. That means that people are going to the hospital for cardiovascular disease and they're leaving alive. But this information is hospital discharges for cardiovascular disease, including people discharged alive, dead, and status unknown. So when you look at it that way, this is really just people hospitalized for cardiovascular disease, and that has continued to increase even with all of these different iterations and dietary recommendations. Diabetes has become epidemic in our society, absolutely huge rates of diabetes. And it almost looks as though it's increased exponentially over the time in which dietary recommendations have focused more on grain-based diets, on low-fat dairy, on low-fat salad dressing, as sort of staples of our diet, this has shot the incidence of diabetes up ridiculously. Obesity has also increased fairly dramatically over the last 40, 50 years. So if you look at this graph, the number of people who are overweight has stayed steady at roughly a third of the American population, but the number of people who are obese has gone up nearly 3 times to over 30%. So a third of people are overweight, a third of people are obese, and something like 6 to 7% are extremely obese. And this, of course, is a huge problem because weight is associated with a bunch of other risk factors. So if you're overweight, you have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, you have a higher risk of diabetes, you have a higher risk of metabolic syndrome, you even have a higher risk of autoimmune disease and cancer. Cancer rates, for the most part, have increased dramatically over this period of time as well. There are certain cancers that have gone down, for example, lung cancer, which has a lot to do with fewer people smoking now than did in the 60s. But on the whole, cancer rates have continued to increase over this period of time. They've maybe leveled out a little bit over the last 10 years, but you can see that this move to lower fat grain-based diets in the 70s and 80s shot cancer rates way up. So not only did it shoot up cardiovascular disease rates, which is what it was designed to prevent, but cancer, obesity, diabetes, even autoimmune disease. So our ability to diagnose autoimmune disease has, of course, improved over the last 50 years. There are a lot of new autoimmune diseases that have been identified, and our ability to diagnose and treat symptomatically has improved over this time frame as well. But if you look at the incident rates, they're only partly attributable to our improvements in diagnostics. They are mostly attributable to increased incidence. There's more people getting autoimmune disease. So if you look at 1950 to 2000, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, these have increased exponentially. Chronic disease in general has become epidemic to the point where, as a society, I think we've forgotten what it feels like to feel healthy. 50% of Americans have 1 or more chronic disease diagnoses, and more than 50% of Americans take 2 or more prescription drugs regularly. 20% of us take 5 or more prescription drugs, and approximately 85% of healthcare spending is for chronic disease. So at a time when we're discussing healthcare reform, I really think we need to be switching that conversation to preventative medicine and how we can educate the population to make better diet and lifestyle choices, make those diet and lifestyle choices easier and more accessible to be able to prevent these diseases. That is really the solution to this problem. The statistics are really scary. So we have 84 million people with cardiovascular disease in this country, with 610 annual deaths just due to heart disease. There's more than other types of cardiovascular disease than just heart disease. 15 million people with cancer, and again, nearly 600,000 annual deaths due to cancer. And with autoimmune disease, estimated prevalence is something like 60 million people. It's one of the top 10 leading causes of death globally. Diabetes is impacting about 29 million people, with an estimated 8 million or so with undiagnosed diabetes. And prediabetes, these are people with insulin resistance that could eventually lead to diabetes. The estimation right now is 87 million Americans. 111 million Americans are obese, and 213 million Americans, or about 70% of us, are overweight or obese. And these are huge problems that can be addressed with diet and lifestyle. So the big question is, how does diet and lifestyle solve this crisis? Well, if you look at the paleo diet itself, we can see that the paleo diet in scientific studies reduces all-cause mortality by 23%. Now, all-cause mortality is a really great general measure of health and longevity. So it follows a group of people for 10 years or so, sometimes longer, and looks at how many people just died from illness, from accident, from old age. So when you pool that information together, you get a really good sense of health in general, because if you're healthy, you have less, you're not going to die as readily from disease. Longevity, right? That's the old age measurement. But also accidental death is a very good measurement of things like mental health, right? So things like addiction increases the chances of accidental death. So that measurement in there helps to also give a really good sort of broad picture of the health of a population. So paleo diet reduces all-cause mortality by 23%. That's a really big number. It increases weight loss success, it reduces all cardiovascular disease risk factors, and lowers all cardiovascular disease mortality. So that is looking at just mortality from cardiovascular disease. Similar to all-cause mortality is a really good measurement of health in general. It reduces inflammation, it improves glycemic control, glucose tolerance. It lowers risk of at least some kinds of cancer. So it lowers all cancer mortality, but it also lowers risk of colorectal adenoma specifically. And we now have some studies looking at the autoimmune protocol specifically. So we know that it improves inflammatory bowel diseases with 73% of patients achieving remission in about 6 weeks. And we know that it dramatically improves symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Now, the other aspect of this, beyond the fact that we have these clinical trials now that are evaluating and pitting paleo and the autoimmune protocol against other dietary interventions and showing that paleo and the autoimmune protocol win out every single time. In addition to this, if you break things down, you'll see that the autoimmune protocol, that the paleo diet, that every single facet is independently linked to reduced disease risk. So if you look at sleep or nutrient density or stress, that each one of these things, there's a great body of scientific literature showing that each one lowers disease risk. So yes, diet and lifestyle can change the landscape of public health. So this is what this course is about. This is what we need. We need a more comprehensive criteria for food. So dietary recommendations till now have been macronutrient focused, right? Protein, carbs, fat. It's been looking at how food's grown rather than the nutrients that food has to offer our bodies. It has not taken into account potentially problematic compounds in foods, which we're going to talk a lot about in weeks 3 and 4 of this lecture series. So it hasn't taken into account that some foods may have valuable nutrition, but may also have compounds in them that are inflammatory, that don't do good things for gut health, that may undermine our health in other ways. So instead, we start to put food on a pros and cons type scale, and we look at what might be in that food that may support our health and what might be in that food that may undermine our health. And we evaluate the merits of that food in a much more sophisticated way. We also need to be looking at lifestyle. So we have all of these recommendations that are focused on diet and carb grams and fat grams and protein. What we need is to be able to look at health holistically and really understand that food is a very important input to health, but it's only one input to health. And that's why the autoimmune protocol incorporates this equal focus on lifestyle choices. And this is the big take-home message that I want you to get from this lecture, is that the autoimmune protocol meets all of these needs to best improve our health. The autoimmune protocol is this very sophisticated way to frame dietary and lifestyle choices to achieve best health, to reduce the incidence of all of these chronic diseases.